Chapter 1. The Crooked Picture. The portrait hung above the fireplace in the music room at Villa Vernia, a bluestone manor house on the outskirts of Lyon. No one knew exactly when it was painted, or who the stern-eyed young man depicted in it was. There was only one certainty. Every time someone crossed the room, they swore the portrait was looking at them from a different angle. On the Sunday afternoon when it all began, Mrs. Amy Vernier was hosting an intimate soiree to celebrate the engagement of her niece, Marianne Delvaux, to the distinguished violinist, Lucien Moreau. The atmosphere was elegant but subdued, as if the house itself were resisting the merriment. Glasses clinked, the notes of a string quartet floated in the air, and everyone tried to ignore the unease caused by the portrait, tilted only a few degrees to the left. Marianne, a young woman of delicate beauty and a soft voice, wore an ivory dress that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lamplight. Lucien, more attentive to his reflection in the glass of a display case than to his fiancée, was conversing with Monsieur Beaumont, an antique dealer who had come from Paris with the promise of authenticating some valuable pieces from the Vernier collection. In one corner, silent as a shadow, stood Clarice Durand, Madame Vernier's lady-in-waiting, a woman no one remembered hiring, but whose presence seemed strangely indispensable. Her grey dress blended with the walls, and only her eyes, dark and alert, moved sharply, observing every exchange, every forced gesture, every prolonged silence. At 9 o'clock sharp, Madame Vernier raised her glass in a toast. A trace of unease crossed her expression as her gaze met the portrait's. He seemed turned away. No one said anything. No one ever did. That night, shortly before 11, a scream broke the silence of the house. The housekeeper, Madame Fournier, had found Lucien, Moreau's body, lying at the foot of the main staircase, his head tilted, a crimson stain spreading beneath him like a sinister flower. It was Clarice Durand who suggested, in a voice that brooked no objection, calling a certain Belgian detective who, was rumoured, was passing through the region. Monsieur Poirot doesn't believe in ghosts, she said firmly, but he does believe in carefully wrapped lies. 2 days later, the sun was barely peeking through the low clouds when Hercule Poirot arrived, wrapped in his usual unwavering elegance. His moustache was perfectly combed, his dark blue suit was without a single wrinkle, and his shoes shone like mirrors. Madame Vernier welcomed him in the library, amid tall bookshelves and faded tapestries that spoke of more prosperous times. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice trembling but controlled, I don't know if you believe in superstitions, but I beg you to listen carefully. Poirot inclined his head slightly. I'm listening, madam. The painting, the portrait over the mantelpiece. It's always been strange. But on the day of the engagement, I'm sure something changed. And then Lucien. Do you think the portrait killed young Moreau? No, she said quickly, blushing in embarrassment at the question, but I'm afraid someone used it, that it was a warning or a threat. Poirot nodded gently. Sometimes, madame, objects tell us more about people than words themselves. Poirot inspected the crime room with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the air. He took in the removed body, the stain on the carpet, the polished mahogany banister, and finally, the portrait. He took 3 steps back, tilted his head, and then smiled slightly. It's funny, he murmured, how something can look different without having changed in the slightest. That's the art of deception. That day, Poirot requested to meet with everyone present during the engagement. He demanded that no one leave the villa, not even the employees. His tone was not authoritarian, but he also did not allow for discussion, and so, as the grandfather clock ticked away with a cadence that seemed slower than usual, the mystery of the portrait that never looked the same way began to unfold its layers. Behind every courteous smile, Poirot sensed tension. Behind every kind word, a carefully veiled reluctance. Because Lucien Moreau's murder, Poirot realized, had not been the product of chance or impulse. It had been precisely engineered, like a sonata in which every dissonant note revealed the true composer, and although no one knew it yet, the small grey cells were already starting to work. Chapter 2. The Faces Behind the Veil. Hercule Poirot, 8. His breakfast on the veranda of Villavernia at dawn, accompanied only by the chirping of birds and a cup of hot chocolate he held in both hands, as if savouring it were part of a ritual. His eyes scanned the perfectly symmetrical front garden, and he couldn't help but smile approvingly. A woman of order, no doubt, he murmured, thinking of Madame Vernier. And yet, in this house, order has been broken. At 9 o'clock sharp, Poirot asked to see each member of the household, one by one, in the music room. He asked so politely, so inoffensively, that no one thought of refusing. The portrait still hung above the fireplace, tilted slightly to the left. No one had touched it since the crime. Marianne Delvaux entered first. Her eyes were surrounded by a shadow of insomnia. She sat opposite Poirot with her hands clasped in her lap, not looking directly at the portrait. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot softly, "your fiancé, Monsieur Moreau. Did you love him?" She hesitated. He was an intense man, fascinating when he wanted to be. "I was flattered by his attention, but lately there was something about him I didn't recognize." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He was studying her gestures, not her words. Was he jealous, perhaps, or were you? She shook her head slowly. He distrusted everyone, even me, he thought. Someone wanted to separate us, and you. Did you want to get married? I thought. So, until recently, he changed. He started having nightmares. He said the portrait was following him. One night he woke up screaming that the eyes in the painting had seen him do something. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Do what? He didn't say it. He just repeated, "Don't look at me like that." The detective made a small mental note. He thanked her politely and dismissed her. Next came Mr. Henry Beaumont, the antique dealer, tall with a sharp chin and an air of cultivated authority. He smelled of papyrus and antique leather. He sat down theatrically. "A lamentable tragedy, Monsieur Poirot. Young Moreau had talent, though he lacked emotional maturity. Too impulsive. Had you known him before? I had seen him in recitals, and I greeted him several times in Paris, but it was here that I really met him. And your opinion of him?" Beaumont bowed his head. He wasn't an easy man. He got irritated easily. He said I had no right to examine the pieces in the Vernier collection. He insinuated I wanted to steal them. And he did it. Steal them, please. I'm a respected expert. I have no need to resort to tricks. Poirot watched the way her ring turned nervously on her finger. "Where were you at 10:30 on the night of the crime?" "In my room, reading a catalogue. Alone." "Yes, as usual." Poirot nodded. The antique dealer rose with a slight bow and left. Then it was Clarice Durand. She entered with such soft steps that Poirot barely heard her. Her presence seemed to absorb the light. "Mademoiselle Clarice," Poirot said without preamble, "you suggested calling me. Why?" "Because the crime was committed with intelligence, she said in a firm, emotionless voice. Not with passion, as some believe. And who do you think did it? It's not my place to say this, but the portrait is where it always was. Yet no one looks at it the same way twice. Asterisk, asterisk. Poirot smiled slightly. And you, how do you see it? As it is. A warning. A mirror into the soul of this house. Everyone fears it sees them. Perhaps with good reason. Were you related to Lucien Moreau? He hated me. He said my presence unnerved Marianne, that I poisoned her with words, that I was too quiet, and it was. I just watch. I listen. In this house, the truth is always whispering. You just have to bow your head. Poirot was silent for a moment. Where were you when the crime occurred? Making an infusion for Mrs. Vernier. She couldn't sleep. And can anyone corroborate this? Poirot nodded his thanks. Clarisse left, without turning around, like a shadow returning to her corner. Then came Madame Fournier, the housekeeper. She arrived with her hands clasped, her face pale and her eyes wet. I found the body, Monsieur Poirot. I'll never forget that image, the blood so red on the carpet. Did you have any conflict with young Moreau? No, monsieur, but sometimes I heard him scream. He talked to himself at night. Once I heard him say, I'll make it disappear. You'll thank me for it. Who was he telling this to? I don't know. He was in his room. I thought he was on the phone, but there was no line at the time. Poirot frowned slightly. And the portrait? Have you noticed anything different? She nodded, her expression grave. Last night I saw it turned toward the hallway, and no one had touched it. Finally, Madame Vernier. She appeared serene, although the wrinkles on her face looked deeper. Lucien had his faults, Monsieur Poirot, but he didn't deserve to die. What did you think about the engagement? It wasn't what I'd dreamed of for Marianne, but I didn't object. I'd rather have her around than watch her run away. Poirot watched her closely, and Clarisse, she's loyal to you, more than anyone. He's been with me through difficult times. He relieved my loneliness. He sees more than he lets on. Poirot stood up slowly. Thank you, madam. Your answers have been helpful. But now I need to see the scene with fresh eyes. When everyone had left, Poirot remained alone in the music room. He walked up to the portrait. He didn't look at it directly. Instead, he sat down in the armchair in front of the fireplace and closed his eyes. A portrait doesn't move. No, but the mind, it does. And what the mind fears, it transforms. After a few minutes, he stood up and examined the frame carefully. There were no hidden mechanisms, no wires, but just behind it, he noticed something strange in the wallpaper. A wrinkle, a subtle rise. He carefully peeled back a corner of the paper. A compartment, hidden behind the portrait, empty. Poirot replaced it without saying a word. As he left the room, he muttered, "The painting doesn't look any different. It's the conscience of the person who looks at it that turns it one way or the other." And with that thought, he went to the dining room, where a cup of tea and a restless mind were waiting for him to continue the game. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Evening fell over Villavernia with a silent languor, as if the air itself refused to disturb the tense balance that reigned in the house. Shadows lengthened on the walls, crossing the corridors like outstretched fingers. In the music room, the notes that once vibrated in Lucien Moreau's recitals now seemed to have retreated to the depths of the piano. Refusing to be summoned again, Poirot returned to the room where Lucien was staying during his stay. It wasn't particularly large, but it was tidy, with a suitcase still not completely unpacked on the armchair. The bed was made, but the rumpled sheets revealed a restless night. Poirot examined the bedside table, a glass of water, an opened pocket watch, and a small black leather notebook. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with energetic, almost violent writing, fragments of scores, unfinished phrases, and names. Some were heavily crossed out. Clarice Beaumont, portrait, right eye, open wound. On the last page, an unfinished musical. Staff. Above it, 3 words. He doesn't look at me the same. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. Then he examined his personal belongings carefully. Among the clothes, he found a small wooden box, inlaid with gold. Inside, a religious medal, split in 2. There was no visible inscription, but the cut was clean and deliberate. Un symbolico roto, murmured Poirot. Un bon roton. OTT. Time, Poirot asked to join Marianne. This time, he chose the South Wing's conservatory, from where he could look out over the garden without being exposed to the wind that was beginning to blow. Marianne arrived dressed in a grey wool coat. She looked more fragile than the night before, as if the stress was beginning to erode her. Mademoiselle Poirot began. Were you aware of the existence of the black notebook? She shook her head, though her response wasn't immediate. No. At least not that one. Lucien wrote often, but he didn't share what he wrote. He said some ideas should only exist on paper, never out loud. Poirot watched her, and Clarice. What did she think of your relationship with her? The young woman visibly shuddered. I feared her. I don't know why exactly. She never said a cruel word to me, but I felt like she could read my soul. And sometimes I had the feeling she expected something from me, like I owed her something, but I didn't know what. Jealousy, maybe. Not from Lucien, but from me. Or from my place in this house. Why Beaumont? Marianne hesitated. He always looked at me as if I were part of a display case, like just another thing to be classified, to be labelled. My aunt appreciates it, but I distrust men who talk too much about authenticity and beauty, and don't look me in the eye when they do it. Poirot nodded. He gently changed the subject. And the portrait, have you seen it move too? Marianne looked down. Her voice cracked slightly. It's never where I remember it. On the day of the engagement, I swear I was looking straight at Lucien. He got nervous. He squeezed my arm hard. He said the painting had threatened. Poirot interlaced his fingers. A man sees threats when his conscience speaks to him. Do you think Lucien had something to hide, mademoiselle? Everyone in this house has it? That evening, Poirot requested a private inspection of the library. Madame Vernier accepted with a gesture. My house is open to your eyes, Monsieur Poirot, she said in a measured tone, although I'm not sure you'll like what you see. Poirot walked calmly along the shelves. He wasn't looking for books per se, but for signs of wear. Frequently touched bindings, displaced dust, titles removed from their logical order. His fingers lingered on a biography of 19th century painters. As he opened it, an envelope fell between his shoes. He picked it up without opening it. It was in Madame Vernier's elegant handwriting, but the recipient was Lucien Moreau. Poirot sat down and read it carefully. The contents were brief. Lucien, I have reviewed the will, and I do not agree with your insinuations. I will not allow blackmail to tarnish my family's name. The portrait is not what you think it is, and it does not belong to you. Don't mention it. Again, Hercule Poirot stood motionless for a long moment. Then he put the letter in his pocket and went to his room. The next morning, Clarice Durand was waiting for him in the living room, uninvited. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, as if continuing an interrupted conversation, "I suppose you have found what you needed." "I've found pieces, mademoiselle, but not yet the complete puzzle. What if I told you that Lucien wasn't the first to fear the portrait?" Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. "Who else?" "Madame Vernier's brother. He died 20 years ago, in this very house. He also said that the painting looked at him differently every day. And he fell down the stairs, too. And the painting, how long has it been there? Since before your father's death. No one knows who painted it, and no one, Monsieur Poirot, dares to remove it." Poirot leaned towards her. "And you? What do you see when you look at it?" She held his gaze without blinking. "See guilt, but not in the painting." Poirot watched her as she left the room. Then he turned and looked back at the portrait. This time, I swear, I was completely focused. Chapter 4. A broken medal and a sealed letter. Hercule Poirot, true to form, began the day with a short walk along the gravel path that skirted the back gardens of Villavernia. The wind carried the scent of wild roses, but also a dense vibration, as if the house's atmosphere were reluctant to yield its secrets. He walked unhurriedly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes absorbed in the perfectly symmetrical design of the trimmed hedge. And yet his little grey cells, as he himself was fond of saying, never rested. The letter found in the library with its icy tone, its allusion to blackmail, and its direct reference to the portrait had unearthed a rotten root beneath the Vernier's aristocratic facade. Added to this was the broken medal and Lucien's encrypted notebook, and the crime began to suggest a previous, as yet unconfessed, crime. Poirot decided to visit Madame Vernier for the second time. He found her sitting in her sewing room, spinning with almost mechanical concentration. The fabric fell onto her lap like a waterfall of silver silk. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without looking up, "I suppose you've come to ask me another awkward question." "Madam," he replied with a gentle bow, "questions are never uncomfortable. It's the truth, that is." She slowly dropped the thread, raised her eyes, and stared at the detective with the calmness of someone who has fought many internal battles. "Did you find the letter?" "Yeah, then you know enough. It was a gift from our father, the last one he gave us before he fell ill. He had it painted by an artist who never signed the work. He said the portrait would protect the house, a superstition. But after Charles died, everyone started saying the painting had looked at him differently just before he fell. The legend grew on its own." Poirot nodded slowly. "And Lucien, how did he come across that story?" "You heard it from Madame Fournier, or maybe from Clarice. The fact is, a month before her death, she began to pressure me. She said the portrait was hiding something. She asked me for access to old documents. She asked me about the will, and one night she raised her voice. She said she knew who else must have died. That was the last time I spoke to her cordially." Poirot looked at her hands. They didn't tremble. Too much control, too much composure for someone who had lost her future and her past on the same stairs. "Do you still have the old will?" asked Poirot. "No, it was destroyed after Charles's death. And who else read it? Just my lawyer, and Clarice. She was my lady-in-waiting even then." "Interesting," said Poirot gently. "Madame, let me be blunt. Were you aware of the existence of a split medal?" For the first time, his face changed. It wasn't surprise. It was sadness. Yes. Charles had it. And then it disappeared. Did you find it? Half. Yes. Then you'll find the other one, where the truth is buried. As he left the room, met Madame Fournier, who was carrying a tea tray. Madame, said Poirot, with a courteous smile, may I ask you one last question? Claro, sir. Do you remember if Lucien received recent correspondence? The woman nodded immediately. He received a letter, sealed with red wax. No return address. I placed it on his desk, myself, the day before his death. Poirot frowned. Did you see it open afterward? No, and we couldn't find her when we went. Through your things, sir. She was gone. Who else knew about your arrival? Clarisse, probably. She gets the mail when I'm not there. Thanks. That same evening, Poirot summoned Clarisse to the main drawing room. The invitation was handwritten, in blue ink, with a typographical precision that reflected his style. When she arrived, she wasn't surprised to see him standing in front of the portrait. The lights dimmed, the grandfather clock solemnly ticking away. Mademoiselle Durand, said Poirot, without turning around, where is the other half of the medal? She didn't respond. Her steps didn't move forward. Do you know why, I ask? Because it's a symbol of fracture. And here, mademoiselle, there are so many broken things, relationships, promises, inheritances. It's not my place to talk about the past. Clarisse finally said, I'm just observing. But he doesn't just observe, right? He also preserves. He also protects. Who was he protecting with that sealed letter? Clarisse looked up for the first time. Her eyes held no fear, just exhaustion. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I asked Lucien to stop digging, and the portrait. He believed there was something behind it, that it would reveal Charles's crime. He didn't understand that the true portrait was himself, reflected in what he feared. When he found the medal, he thought he had proof, but he didn't understand what it meant to be broken from before birth. Poirot took a step towards her, and, you, mademoiselle, what is your relationship with Charles Vernier? The answer came as a whisper. He was my father. Poirot was unfazed, and therefore you are part of the family. Never officially, never legally, I was. The mistake, the secret Madame Vernier chose to protect, with dignity, with shame, she took me in, and Lucien knew, and that's why he died. Clarisse looked down. I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot. But I did see his obsession turn into madness. He was looking for something that would make him the master of this house. And the house, ... It didn't belong to him. Poirot nodded slowly. He didn't accuse. He didn't absolve. He only understood. Thank you, mademoiselle. And as Clarisse left, the drawing room, the portrait over the fireplace remained fixed, unchanging. But Poirot was no longer looking at it, because now, at last, he knew where the important gaze was directed. Chapter 5. What the painting didn't say. The night at Villa Vernier was so dense that not even the stars seemed able to appear. Only the moon, hidden behind a veil of clouds, cast a dull glow that gave the stone walls an ashen hue. Hercule Poirot was still in the music room, standing in front of the portrait, while absolute silence seemed to breathe beside him. It was not the stillness of calm, but that which precedes revelation, a truth waiting to be named. There was something in that painting that had never been said, not a glance as many believed, but an omission, a carefully placed emptiness. Poirot, approached slowly. He studied the eyes of the young man in the portrait. They were not exactly identical. The right one was slightly smaller, deeper in its painted socket. At a normal distance, it was unnoticeable. But for someone like Poirot, obsessed with symmetry, it was a deliberate sign. A different right eye, he murmured, as if one were looking inward and the other outward. He took a small magnifying glass out of his pocket and examined the stroke. The brush stroke was newer, brighter in the left eye. The right eye was darker, more aged, as if it had been repainted. Poirot narrowed his eyes. He took a step back. Then another. He looked at the base of the frame. He touched the moulding. And finally, with the delicacy of one dealing with sacred relics, he slid the pad of his finger under the lower edge. He found a groove. He pressed it with a soft click. A compartment opened. Inside, folded in four, was an old sheet of paper, brittle with age. Poirot carefully removed it and placed it on the nearby desk. The paper was yellowed, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. It was a letter signed by Charles Vernier, loved. If you ever read this, it's because the secret is out. I refused to cut Clarisse out of my will. She's my daughter, and I won't let her grow up in the shadows. I know you don't love her, but you must understand that it's not her fault. If anything happens to me, you'll know who had reasons to silence me. Charles Poirot closed his eyes. The letter not only confirmed the truth Clarisse had already hinted at, it also added a new angle. Charles had not died by accident. Someone, fearing the consequences of such legitimization, had acted, and Lucien Moreau, by digging into the past, had unleashed an echo that still resonated. The next morning, Poirot asked everyone to gather in the library. The atmosphere was charged. No one spoke, but everyone exchanged glances that met like sheathed knives. The portrait, now covered with a white cloth on Poirot's orders, seemed more present than ever. "My lords and gentlemen," said Poirot, rising, "the time has come to organize. The facts, this is no longer a question of ghosts or superstitions, but of memory. And memory, when repressed, manifests itself in the strangest ways." Everyone was listening. Even Clarisse, standing by the window, like a figure painted in frosted glass. 20 years ago, Charles Vernier died on these very stairs. The incident was declared an accident, but it wasn't. He had decided to include his illegitimate daughter in his will. That daughter is Clarisse Durand. A murmur arose in the room, followed by a silence even thicker than before. Poirot continued, unperturbed. Madame Vernier destroyed that will, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of scandal. But what is hidden doesn't disappear. It only becomes poisoned. Madame Vernier, sitting stiffly, raised her chin, but denied nothing. Lucien Moreau discovered this story, not out of nobility. No, don't be fooled, but because he thought he could benefit from it. He imagined he could force a new agreement, perhaps even annul the engagement with Marianne if a better opportunity arose. Lucien was talented, but also cruel. Poirot walked slowly among those present. The problem was that Lucien didn't understand the true power of the portrait. Not its gaze, not its origin, but what it held. A letter hidden by Charles. A letter Clarisse never knew existed. Beaumont, who had been silent, finally raised his voice. And what does that have to do with his death? Poirot looked at him. Monsieur Beaumont, you're an antique dealer, an expert in objects. You know what a secret hidden in a frame can be worth. Didn't you find it curious that Lucien, a violinist with no interest in art, insisted so much on the painting. Beaumont tensed. He asked me to. He wanted me to analyze it. He said the portrait had a story, but he never told me why. Poirot nodded slowly. And when you discovered it, you understood everything. You found a letter, perhaps even before Lucien. You understood its value, and you understood that Clarisse was the key to another story, a more valuable, rarer one. The forgotten heiress. Beaumont opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a hand. I'm not accusing you of murder, monsieur, but I am accusing you of manipulation. I believe you fueled Lucien's suspicions, urged him to blackmail Madame Vernier, hoping the conflict would weaken him. You wanted everything to explode so you could pick up the fragments later, as you do with broken relics. Beaumont paled. That's absurd. Poirot ignored him. But someone else did act. Someone who, driven by a mixture of guilt, fear, and misguided love, decided to intervene. Clarisse, you warned Lucien, didn't you? Yes, she admitted, without blinking. But she didn't kill him. She just begged him to stop. So what? Who did it? Poirot remained silent for a moment longer. The moment for the great revelation had not yet arrived, but the circle was beginning to close. The truth, still nameless, was already in the room. Mesdames and messieurs, he said finally, this house isn't cursed, but its memory is. And when you. Chapter 6. The hand that didn't touch the railing. The main hall of Villa Vernier had witnessed 2 deaths in 20 years, and now an anonymous note floated over that space with the weight of a confession. The phrase "I did it for her," written in slanted handwriting and still fresh ink, had fallen like a shadow over the faces gathered in the library. No one dared to speak. No one wanted to be the first to breathe. Poirot stared at the box with the remaining half of the medal between his gloved fingers. He didn't rush. He turned the piece slowly, as if waiting for her to speak before he did. Then he joined it with its counterpart, already in his possession. They fit together with silent perfection. The symbol was complete. A confession without a signature, he said finally, without raising his voice, is just a cowardly whisper. Madame Vernier leaned lightly back in the armchair, her expression hardened by the dignity she no longer attempted to feign. Marianne, beside her, seemed more confused than frightened. Beaumont kept his arms crossed and his brow furrowed, as if still trying to calculate the exact value of chaos. Clarisse, standing, looked at no one, only at the portrait still covered by the white cloth. Poirot turned to Madame Fournier. Where exactly was the box found? In the laundry room, on top of the water heater. And believe me, sir, it wasn't there last night. Who has free access to that area? Everyone, the employees, the guests. The laundry room is at the back of the east wing. No one watches it. Poirot nodded slowly, but his eyes went beyond words. So, my friends, he said to the group, allow me a reconstruction, one that, perhaps, will bring us closer to what happened that fateful night. With Madame Vernier's permission, Poirot led everyone to the main staircase. It was wide, made of white marble, with a wrought iron banister. At its base, a shadow could still be seen on the carpet, not red, not fresh, but still present, like a half-healed wound. Poirot stood at the foot of the stairs and pointed upwards. Lucien Moreau fell from the second landing. He wasn't pushed violently. There were no signs of a struggle. He didn't scream. He didn't try to catch himself. And do you know why? No one answered. Only the faint creak of Beaumont's boots broke the silence. Because he trusted. Poirot continued. He trusted the person with him, someone who accompanied him in silence, perhaps pretending to hear a final confession, someone whose presence wasn't suspicious, someone Lucien didn't fear. "Are you suggesting," Marianne asked, her voice breaking, "that it was an accident?" Poirot shook his head gently. No, it was a decision. And he walked slowly down the steps, pausing at the second landing. Then he bent down. He aimed for the outer edge, where the railing began its downward curve. There should be fingerprints here. A hand clutching the railing, the instinct of a man falling. But there's nothing. Which tells me that Lucien didn't try to catch himself. And that makes me wonder, why? Marianne murmured, "Why didn't you know you were falling?" "Or because he dropped it," Clarice said, barely audible. Poirot looked at her. "Exactly, mademoiselle, and only someone who knows another's fears well can induce them to walk toward them." He walked slowly down the steps. Lucien became paranoid. He saw threats in a portrait. He thought someone was watching him. He slept badly. He became obsessed with secrets. What he needed wasn't an enemy, but a shadow. Someone who wouldn't touch him, but would push him to the edge. Someone who would say, "No one believes you. No one will protect you. No one will stop you." Clarice took a deep breath. Her voice came out deep and resigned. "I told him that, everyone." Turned to her. "I didn't want to kill him," she continued. "I just wanted him to stop digging, stop threatening my mother, stop using me as a weapon. I didn't know he'd do what he did." Poirot did not move. "But you knew he was unstable." "Yeah, so why did you follow him that night?" Clarice pressed her lips together. "Because he asked me to accompany him to the portrait. He wanted to open it. He said there was something behind it, that the letter would change everything. I told him he was crazy, that not even his music would be preserved if he continued down this path. He looked at me as if he couldn't bear that I didn't believe in him." "Did he touch it?" "No, he stepped forward. He took 2 steps, and then he just dropped." Silence. Poirot looked at the railing again. Then he stepped down. "A tragedy, yes, but not a murder in the legal sense. However, Mademoiselle Durand, when you wrote I did it for her, was referring to Madame Vernier. Yes, I did it for my mother, to protect her silence." Poirot walked over to Madame Vernier. She wasn't crying, but there was complete defeat in her eyes, the expression of someone who knows that what's been buried too deep always comes back. "And now," Madame Poirot asked gently, "are you ready to give him back his name?" She nodded slowly. "There's nothing to hide anymore." That afternoon, Poirot went up to the music room one last time. He uncovered the portrait with firm hands. He looked into its eyes. This time, they both seemed to be looking in the same direction. "It's not that the painting moved," Poirot whispered. "It's that each of us projected onto it what we most feared, and some, what we most desired. A silent truth, like a hand that never touched the railing, but changed the course of everything." Chapter 7. An echo in the last note. The town had changed, not on its walls, nor in its portraits, nor on its staircases. But something in the air was different, as if the house had exhaled for the first time in years. Clarice had spoken the truth, or at least the part of it that could be named. And yet, for Hercule Poirot, the mystery was not yet complete. Small, silent pieces were missing, details that did not fit with the exactness his investigations. demanded small grey cells, the soul of a crime even, if it wasn't murder, often left traces more subtle than the physical ones, fragments of pride, crumbs of intent, poorly concealed emotions. And one of those pieces still echoed in Poirot's mind, the unsigned letter, the broken medal, and above all, the figure who had remained most in the background, Henry Beaumont. While everyone else had bared their wounds, he had maintained a careful profile, cultivating the mask of the observant man. But Poirot was no naive spectator. He had heard the exact tone of the pauses in his voice, the overly casual way in which the antique dealer had commented on the portrait's authenticity, and the way his name appeared, didn't appear in Lucien's notebook. That morning, Poirot asked to see him in the reading room, where the midday light streamed through antique stained glass windows and cast colours onto the floor like pieces of a puzzle. Beaumont arrived punctually, with his dark wooden cane and his bottle green velvet waistcoat carefully buttoned. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a gentle smile, "I imagine this will be more than just a talk about art." "You imagine well, Monsieur Beaumont." Poirot indicated the armchair opposite him, and waited for him to settle down before speaking. "You're among the most polite people I've ever met, but also among the most evasive." "Evasive?" Beaumont raised an eyebrow. "Why would I evade anything? That's precisely the question. Why would I do that?" Poirot placed a folder on his knees. He opened it slowly. It contained a copy of a report discreetly requested the day after Lucien's death. Professional background, acquisition records, and a signed letter Lucien had written 2 weeks before his death to a gallery owner in Marseille. I discovered something at Villavernia that contradicts Beaumont's report. The portrait has been altered, not by the original artist, but by later hands. The right eye has been altered. The pigment doesn't match. The antiquarian is lying, and if he's lying about that, what else is he hiding? Beaumont said nothing, but leaned forward slightly. A shadow appeared across his face, barely perceptible. Poirot continued in a calm voice. "You knew that Lucien had detected the alteration in the painting, and you knew that if the portrait was fake or tampered with, his reputation could suffer. Was that your real interest? The authenticity, or what the portrait concealed?" Beaumont calmly interlaced his fingers. "What the portrait was hiding. Of course, we all knew it. The family secret, the letter. But that didn't interest me. What interested me was the piece itself." Poirot tilted his head. "And what would have happened if Lucien had destroyed it in search of something? Or if he had exposed its falsehood?" Beaumont smiled sadly. "A portrait is more valuable for what it represents than for how it was painted. But Lucien didn't understand. He wanted to take it apart, to put it on display, to destroy it if necessary. And yes, I tried to dissuade him, and he pressured him. I directed him. I suggested he talk to Clarice, that he provoke his aunt. I wanted him to give up before he acted, to desist. But he, D. Beaumont, looked at Poirot directly. No, and that night I blamed myself for it. Because I saw him leave his room, I followed him silently. I heard him arguing with Clarice from the hallway. I heard his voice break, but I didn't intervene because I thought it was the end of his obsession. That if he broke, we'd all win." Poirot nodded slowly. "And so it was, but not without cost." Beaumont looked down. "Do you think that makes me guilty? Not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. We are all complicit in the silence. You, because of your ambition, Madame Vernier, because of your pride. Clarisse, because of her grief. Marianne, because of her blindness. And Lucien, because of his vanity. Beaumont stood up. For the first time, he looked older. So that's the truth, right? That no one killed him, and that we all pushed him a little. Poirot looked at him gently. The tragedy, Monsieur Beaumont, is that there are crimes without criminals, but never without consequences. That afternoon, Poirot walked through the greenhouse, where Marianne was watering a row of lilies. Her movements were slow, automatic. Seeing him, she gave a weak smile. "Is everything resolved?" he asked without looking. "Almost everything." Poirot approached. "Mademoiselle, did you know about Clarisse?" "No, but I always felt it. That nameless connection. That sadness of his, always present, and now it seems unfair to me that he found out like this, that he only found out when everything had already fallen apart." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. "And what will you do with that?" "Knowledge." She raised her eyes. There was something new in them, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. "I'll plant it," he said, "so it doesn't grow back like a secret." Poirot smiled. After so many years, Villavernia finally seemed like a place where something could flourish without being hidden. And as he walked away down the tiled hallway, he could still hear, in the back of his mind, the echo of one last note, not that of a piano, nor that of a crime, but rather that of a truth that, although late, had finally made itself heard. Chapter 8. The Symmetry of Silence. Night descended on Villavernia like grey silk. There was no wind, no crickets chirping, no twigs rustling, only silence, a thick, polished silence, almost beautiful in its symmetry. It was the kind of silence Poirot knew well, the kind that precedes final decisions, the kind that follows, the moment when secrets cease to be hidden and begin to weigh. He was in his room, in front of his open suitcase. His clothes were neatly folded. His shoes were perfectly lined up. But he wasn't packing yet. Something was holding him back. For although everyone believed the case was solved, that Lucien had cracked under the weight of his own obsessions, that Clarisse had pushed fate with a calculated phrase, that Beaumont had manipulated without playing Poirot, knew there was still a discord. A note that did not fit the final chord. A sentence, a simple sentence. "I did it for her." Clarisse hadn't written that note. He knew that now. The handwriting, though similar, was firmer, less curved. Clarisse wrote like someone hiding. That note spoke like someone protecting herself. Poirot got up, went silently downstairs, and headed for the sewing room, where he knew he would find Madame Vernier. Not because he was expecting her, but because, like him, she didn't sleep when the threads of logic were still loose. He found her sitting by the reading lamp in a black velvet robe. Between her fingers, the needle moved with incredible slowness. An unfinished lace, white as a veil without an owner. "You can't sleep, madame," he said softly. "In this house," she replied without looking at him, "sleep is a privilege reserved for the ignorant." Poirot approached and sat down carefully. "I came to talk about a note that appeared in the laundry." With the broken medal, she continued sewing without breaking the rhythm. "Clarisse's note. It's not your handwriting." The needle stopped. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Silence. Then Madame Vernier lowered her work, folded her hands in her lap, and looked up. She was tired, yes, but there was something else in her eyes, an exact, cold, almost mathematical detachment. "So I guess, you know." Poirot did not nod, but he did not need to. You left the note and the medal. It was your way of concluding the story, with perfect balance. Madame Vernier sighed. It wasn't a crime. I didn't push him. I didn't threaten him. I didn't touch him. But I was the one who planted the seed. Poirot did not contradict her. I knew Clarisse would confront him. She continued. I knew he was on the brink. It wasn't an exact calculation, but it was a moral gamble. If he stopped, she would forgive everything. But if he persisted, if he defied history, history itself would reject him. That's not justice, madame. It's design. And isn't that what we do, Monsieur Poirot? You with your grey cells, me with my invisible threads, designing order where chaos wants to prevail. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And what would he have done if he hadn't died? I would have exiled him. From my home, from my inheritance, from my life. I would have told Marianne the truth. I would have acknowledged Clarisse, albeit with shame, but it was no longer necessary. Fate finished the job. Poirot stood up slowly. You didn't kill Madame, but you wished for an end, and you got it. She didn't respond. She picked up the needle again. And Clarisse, Poirot asked from the doorway, does she know what you did? Madame Vernier did not look up. No, nor will he know. Weren't you the one who said there are crimes without criminals, but never without consequences? Poirot left without reply. At dawn, Poirot asked to speak to Clarisse once more. He found her in the greenhouse, sitting on the iron bench, surrounded by ferns. She was holding a stemless flower in her hands, as if waiting for it to grow back. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, I haven't come to question you, just to say goodbye. She nodded. She didn't smile. Did you find everything you were looking for? Almost everything, and what not? I've learned that some pieces don't fit together because they're not meant to. She looked at him, as if she sensed that he knew more than he was letting on. And the note? Poirot smiled slightly. It wasn't yours, but it served its purpose. Clarisse took a deep breath. The flower between her fingers was slowly crumbling. And my mother, she's stronger than she looks, but also more fragile than she thinks. She closed her eyes for a moment. Do you think he'll recognize me publicly? Poirot did not reply immediately. I think he'll do it the way he knows how, with silent actions, never with words. But sometimes, mademoiselle, that's enough. Before leaving, Poirot passed by the music room one last time. The portrait hung again in its place, restored, centered, motionless. He looked at it for a few minutes. Then he spoke, as if the painted young man could hear him. It wasn't you who was looking, it was them. They all cast their shadows on you, and you cast them back. Poirot closed the door behind him. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. The silence was no longer symmetrical. It was human, imperfect. And finally, sincere. Chapter 9. The portrait in the inkless notebook. The villa seemed clearer that morning, not because of the light, which filtered weakly through low clouds, but because of the subtle sensation, imperceptible to anyone but Hercule Poirot, that the masks had fallen, not completely, of course. Some remained intact, but the crack was already visible. The fabric of secrets had begun to unravel. And yet Poirot didn't leave the villa immediately. Something still held him back. It wasn't doubt, but a more precise unease, the certainty that the most important thing of all had gone unnoticed by those involved. He headed back to Lucien Moreau's room. He hadn't revisited it since the early days of the investigation, but there was something there that, now with all the pieces exposed, demanded a second look. In his pocket, he carried the small black notebook he'd found at the beginning. He'd reviewed it several times already, but now he had new clues and new silences to listen to. The room was the same as the last time. A half-unpacked suitcase, crumpled sheet music, a handkerchief forgotten under the chair, as if Lucien might return at any moment. Poirot sat down in the chair in front of the desk and opened his notebook. The pages were filled with musical notes, disjointed words, repeated names, nothing new. But as he turned the last page, his fingers stumbled upon something that wasn't. Paper on the leather spine, right along the inside edge, he noticed a separation. He carefully inserted his fingernail and extracted a very thin, almost transparent sheet of paper, folded with precision. Unfolding it was like revealing the hidden image of a dream, a drawing, not in pencil or ink. It was merely a pressure on the paper, as if the image had been engraved with a needle or the point of a pin, a face. There was no doubt, it was the portrait, not the painting hanging in the music room, but a different version, a primitive sketch. The gaze was softer, the expression sadder, but the most revealing thing was that the face wasn't looking straight ahead, but to the side. Poirot narrowed his eyes. That wasn't a fantasy, it was a sign, an indication that Lucien, before falling, had realized that the painting everyone was seeing wasn't the original, that what hung in the living room was a retouched version, rewritten. He stood up and went straight to find Madame Fournier, who was in the pantry organizing jars with mechanical movements. When she saw him, she put down the jar she was holding and dried her hands on her apron. "Do you need anything, Monsieur Poirot?" "Just an honest answer, Madame," who had access to the painting before the crime. She blinked. Which painting? To the portrait in the music room. The one everyone fears. She frowned. Then, with a sigh, she leaned against the wall. A week before the evening, Madame Vernier asked me to call a restorer. She said there was damp on the back of the frame. A man came, discreetly. He was only there for 2 hours. No one saw him, and then he left. Madame asked me not to tell the others. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, and that man signed the entry register. No, he came in through the service. Door Clarice opened it for him. I watched him leave. He had his briefcase and a rolled-up copy of the portrait. Poirot stared at her. A copy, yes. I knew because it didn't weigh anything. It was paper. And because when he left, the painting was already hanging again. But Clarice asked him not to tell anyone. She said it was for protection. Poirot thanked her with a slight bow. Then he headed to the East Wing, where Clarice was sorting through scores in the library. "Mademoiselle," he said bluntly, "were you aware that the painting had been replaced?" She tensed. It took her a few seconds to respond. "Not replaced, restored. No, mademoiselle, you don't restore an expression. You don't repaint a look. You replace a story. And that's what was done." Clarice looked down. "She did it for her," he said. "For my mother. She said she was tired of seeing that face. That it was time I stopped looking reproachfully. And you allowed it." "Yes, and Lucien discovered it. He said the painting wasn't the same, that it didn't have the same weight, that he'd been emotionally castrated, that he no longer said what he needed to say." Poirot folded his hands, and that's where his despair began. It wasn't just what he discovered about the family. It was losing the only symbol he still considered true. He believed the painting held a curse, but what he couldn't accept was that it had also been domesticated, that history had been manipulated, even down to its expression. And you, Do you think they should have left it as it was? Clarice pressed her lips together. I don't know. It was a face that always looked at us without compassion, but maybe that was exactly what we needed. To see him as he was. That evening, Poirot asked for a moment alone in the music room. He approached the portrait. He looked at it for a long time, and then, with precise determination, he removed the frame from the wall and placed it on the floor. Behind the canvas, as he ran his fingers along the back, he felt a distinct layer of fabric. He pulled carefully. There it was, the original portrait. They'd painted it over an older canvas without destroying it. They'd just covered it up. The expression on that forgotten face wasn't that of a vigilante. It was that of a martyr, someone carrying an unspoken pain. He looked sideways, as if he'd already seen too much. Poirot covered him again, respectfully, not because he believed in curses, but because he understood the value of a complete story. The silence of the village was no longer symmetry. It was an echo, one who came from the past, and finally dared to speak. Chapter 10. Where look at me, and remember me they match. The next morning brought a dim, even light, like a cloth stretched across the sky. There was no sun or defined shadow, only a grey glow that enveloped everything with the same delicacy as wrapping an ancient coffin. At Villavernia, the atmosphere was one of containment. Words were spoken in lower voices. Footsteps were softer, as if, somehow, everyone knew that something essentially visible and definitive had changed during the night. Poirot walked slowly down the south wing corridor, where family portraits hung in an unbroken line. They were all faces of the Vernier lineage, serious men, women with high hairdos, still expressions, and eyes that never shied away from the viewer's gaze. There was something ritual about that gallery, each face a stepping stone in the construction of a family name that seemed to have forgotten human warmth in favor of permanence. The heritage here wasn't just economic, it was aesthetic, symmetrical, silent. The last portrait, however, now hanging in the background, was different. It was the original portrait, secretly recovered by Poirot the night before, when he removed the forged painting that covered it. He hadn't put it on public display. He'd only shown it to one person. Clarice, the young woman, hadn't cried. She had just stared at him silently for several minutes, and then, in a calm voice, she had said, "That's how I remember it, not how it was painted, like this." In the dining room, Madame Vernier was having breakfast alone. The linen tablecloth, the fresh flowers, the china, everything was still in place, as every day, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. Poirot entered unannounced. She didn't seem surprised. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, without looking up. "I found what was buried," he replied, "which isn't the same thing." He sat down in front of her. "And now what?" she asked after a pause. "Will you tell everyone that we replaced the original portrait? That Clarice lived within these walls as a shameful secret while I tried to redesign the past?" Poirot did not reply immediately. "Madame, why didn't you let the face speak?" She finally looked up. Her eyes, this time, held neither pride nor guilt, only a deep exhaustion, because the face spoke of me, not of Charles, not of Clarice. It spoke of me, of what I was unable to hold, of what I denied, and one day I just couldn't take it any more. I asked for it to be covered up. I didn't erase it. I didn't dare, but I couldn't bear it anymore. It was a gesture, cowardly, but also human, Poirot nodded. And yet, that image, the real one, was the only one Lucien recognized as authentic, not because of what it said, but because it didn't lie. She looked away towards the window. "Lucien," he said, barely. He too was searching for a reflection, but he didn't find it in Marianne, or in her music, or in power. And when he looked at the portrait and saw that he wasn't the same anymore, he thought the world had abandoned him completely. Poirot watched her with a mixture of compassion and accuracy. "It wasn't you who pushed him, madame, but it was you who took the last mirror from him." That afternoon, Marianne approached Poirot in the gardens. They were walking among the wisteria that climbed the stone arches. She was holding a closed notebook. "Monsieur Poirot," he said clearly, "I wanted to show you something." He handed him the notebook. Poirot opened it. Inside were scores written by Lucien, but among the notes, in the margins, were small phrases, sometimes crossed out, sometimes circled. Fragments of thoughts. Some were almost illegible. "The portrait doesn't judge me. It recognizes me. She is the echo that does not want to sound. If anyone ever sees me, don't look straight at me." Poirot slowly turned each page. Then he closed the notebook and handed it back to her. "Thank you," he said. "Not for what it contains, but for what it confirms." And what does it confirm? That Lucien wasn't a criminal, nor a martyr. He was a cracked mirror. And in a house of perfect reflections, a cracked mirror is unbearable. She looked down. "Dude, you think he loved someone? I don't think I knew how, but I wanted to. And that, mademoiselle, is also a form of love. Incomplete, clumsy, but real." Marianne nodded slowly. Then she walked down the stone path, clutching her notebook to her chest. Poirot packed his things that night. This time, yes, everything fit together. Not because the mystery had been perfectly solved, but because the silence surrounding it no longer lied. Before leaving, he asked to see Clarisse one last time. He found her in the music room, where the portrait, the real one, was back in its place. No one had covered it. No one dared to do so anymore. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, "I want you to know, not all secrets should become public revelations, but all deserve a form worthy of memory." She nodded. She approached the portrait and lightly touched the frame. "Do you think I look like him?" "Not physically," Poirot replied, "but there's something in his gaze that has passed into yours. The exact melancholy of someone who knows they've been looked at, but not seen." She looked at him without tears. "Thank you." Poirot bowed gently, in his unmistakable style. "Goodbye, miss." And he left the room. That evening, as he climbed into the car that would take him back to Lyon, Poirot took one last look at the silhouette of the villa. The windows were dull eyes. The portraits were hanging shadows. But somewhere, beneath layers of paint and generations of silence, someone finally had said, "Look at me," and another, for the first time, had responded, "I remember you." Chapter 11. The inheritance that no one named. 2 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot left Villa Vernia, and yet, for those who lived within its walls, time didn't move at the same pace as outside. In that place, the days were long echoes, and the nights, extensions of a single shadow. Lucien Moreau's death continued to hover in every room, not like a one-time tragedy, but like a word never spoken that everyone understood. But the world doesn't stop just because you want it to. An inheritance, that word so simple and so brutal, had begun to knock at the door. The family lawyer, Monsieur Renard, arrived one Thursday morning with 2 leather briefcases and the neutral voice of someone who has seen too many families break up over clauses. He was welcomed into the library parlour, where Madame Vernier was waiting for him with her shoulders squared and her face as serene as ever, although the creases under her eyes seemed deeper. Mrs. Vernier, Renard said after the usual greetings, "As you requested, I brought the updated will, as well as your brother Charles's original. I know it's been a while, but I thought it prudent to keep it." She nodded slightly, still not looking at the documents, and he asked me the lawyer continued to prepare an alternative wording in case he wanted to make an inclusion, Madame. Vernier looked up. "Yes, for my daughter." The phrase hung in the air. It wasn't loud or shaky. It was simply new. It had never been said before. Renard didn't question it. It wasn't his place. Full name, Clarisse Vernier. And then, after a brief pause, "If you wish, you can also keep the name Durand. There's no need to erase what has protected you." The lawyer began to write, without any further words. Clarisse, for her part, knew nothing until Madame Vernier called her into her study that same afternoon. The room had a different feel. The objects were arranged as usual, but there were flowers. In the vase, a photo of young Charles on the table, and, in one corner, Lucien's notebook. "Did you call me, ma'am?" Clarisse asked, pausing in the doorway. "Come in," the woman said. "Unlock the door." She obeyed. She walked slowly to the center of the room, like someone who doesn't know whether she's about to receive news or a verdict. "I've made arrangements," Madame Vernier said. "The will has been amended. I've legally recognized you as Charles's daughter. You will inherit a share of the estate. And, if you wish, you may also use the surname." Clarisse didn't respond. She didn't even breathe deeply. She just blinked once, as if she'd been waiting for him all her life. And yet, she didn't know what to do now that he'd arrived. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Because there's no one watching the doors anymore, not in the house and not in me." He was silent for a moment. "Because I can no longer let the dead write our story." Clarisse approached the desk. She looked at the papers, her mother's signature, her full name, and "If I don't accept it, ... he asked in a low voice. "Would that change anything?" Madame Vernier shook her head sweetly, without resentment. "No, because what belongs to you can no longer be returned to silence." Days later, Marianne found a package in her room with no return address. Inside, a single object, an antique golden key, unlabeled. At first, she thought it was a mistake. But then she noticed that the lock on the music cabinet, the one Lucien had tampered with so much in. His final days seemed to have changed position. He tried the key. It fit. There wasn't much inside. Some familiar scores to incomplete manuscripts, and an envelope sealed with blue wax. He opened it with trembling hands. It was a letter from Lucien, Marianne. "If you're reading this, it's because I didn't come back. I don't know if I left by choice or by mistake. All I know is that, of all the things I wanted to possess, you were the one thing I didn't know how to hold. Forgive me if I hurt you. Forgive me if I left you with more questions than answers. But please, don't let the portrait be the last word in this house. Let your music be louder than the paintings." She didn't cry, but she took the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of her most precious notebook, Nocturne for a Grey Morning. The piece Lucien had begun writing the week of the engagement. That same day, he went down to the piano for the first time since his death. Not to play the usual, but to finish the unfinished score. The music that filled the room wasn't perfect, but it had truth in it. Meanwhile, in Lyon, Poirot received a short letter on blue paper. He didn't say much. Mr. Poirot, the villa no longer holds secrets, only open rooms. Thank you. See. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his inside pocket, and neatly rearranged the ends of his handkerchief. He poured himself a cup of hot chocolate and smiled with measured satisfaction. The most important inheritance, he said softly, doesn't always have numbers. Sometimes it's just a name that no longer hurts to say. And in Villavernia, in the music room, the portrait still hung, but this time no one looked the other way. Chapter 12. The last place no one wanted to sit. The green salon at Villavernier was the least frequented room in the house. Despite its elegance with its embroidered tapestries, worn velvet armchairs, and white marble fireplace, something about its layout seemed to discourage any attempt at lingering. It wasn't a question of temperature or light, but of memory. There, in a corner of the room, stood an empty armchair that no one, for years, had dared to occupy. Nigh Marianne, not even Madame Vernier. The armchair in question, with turned legs and upholstered in a duller green than the others, was reputed to have belonged to Charles Vernier. This wasn't a childhood superstition, nor a service legend. It was a tacit understanding, as if that corner were still filled with an interrupted conversation that no one wanted to resume. And yet, one cloudy autumn afternoon, as the wind blew dry leaves through the garden, Clarisse entered the green room alone. She carried a book in her hand, a light sweater draped over her shoulders, and the serene face of someone who had ceased to fear her own thoughts. He looked at the armchair, not with fear, but with exhaustion, like someone looking at a closed wound that still hurts, but no longer bleeds, and he sat down. The gesture was simple, but in that house it was a silent revolution. Madame Vernier found her there shortly after, as she entered with the intention of looking for a forgotten vase. She stopped dead in her tracks, not out of surprise, but out of recognition of the exact moment she had put off for decades. Clarisse looked up. She closed her book. She didn't smile, she just waited. The woman walked to the window without speaking. She stopped by the curtain, placed a hand on the frame, and said, "When Charles died, that chair remained there as a question I never wanted to ask myself again." Clarisse didn't respond. "I kept it," he continued, "not out of respect, but out of guilt. Sometimes I think we keep objects not because they bring us comfort, but because they remind us of the punishment we believe we deserve." And yet, Clarisse said softly, the punishment was never to sit down again. Madame Vernier turned her face slightly. There were tears that wouldn't come out, but there was a voice that was beginning to crack. "My brother made mistakes. So did I. I was cruel to you, not because of who you were, but because of what you reminded me of. Every time I saw you, I saw the face of a woman I hated, and a man who had betrayed me. I couldn't tell you apart from them. I didn't need him to. Love me," Clarisse said, "just not deny me." The mother approached. Slowly, she stopped in front of the armchair, and for the first time, she looked down at her daughter without a shield, without a posture, without a surname in the way. "Can I sit down?" Clarisse nodded, and so together they occupied the space that for so long had been a formless absence. That evening, at dinner, Marianne brought a new score. She placed it on the piano without ceremony. The notes were still written in pencil, unfinished in the final bars, but the melody was beginning to take solid form. She had taken fragments from Lucien's notebook, combining them with motifs of her own, with scraps from her memory. He titled it Fragment for an Empty Armchair. Fragment for an Empty Armchair. He performed it just once, not with virtuosity, but with sincerity. When he finished, no one applauded, but no one spoke for a long time either. The music had said everything that needed to be said. After dessert, Marianne approached Clarisse. She offered her the music book, opened to the first page. "It's yours too," he said. It wasn't just his, or mine. This house has too many half-written things. Clarisse received it without words. She caressed the paper with her fingers, as if a memory lived there too. "Thank you," he murmured, "not for the notebook, for listening to him, even when he was wrong." Marianne nodded. "We all make mistakes, but some have the decency to leave music as an apology." In Lyon, Poirot received a second letter, this time on a lawyer's letterhead. "Mr. Poirot, please find attached confirmation of the official registration of Mrs. Amy Vernier's new will, in which Clarisse Vernier-Durand has been recognized as the legitimate heir to part of the family estate. Furthermore, according to express instructions, the original portrait has been registered as a private historical asset and may not be sold, altered, or removed without the joint consent of both heirs." A small gesture, perhaps, but in this house, silence always weighed more than objects. With respect, M. Renard. Poirot placed the letter on his desk. He leaned back in his armchair and smiled slightly. A house where everyone can finally sit, even when no one wanted to sit before. He murmured, "Voila, that's justice." And he closed his eyes. At Villa Vernier that night, no one covered the portrait, neither out of respect nor out of fear. And in the green room, the armchair was no longer empty, just occupied by memory, but this time without shame. Chapter 13. The voice that the painting never said. Villa Vernier had finally found a kind of balance. Not complete peace. That kind of calm doesn't visit houses with so many closed rooms, but a tacit pact with its history. The original portrait hung in its place, unveiled, untouched. Clarisse had a name, Marianne had music, and Madame Vernier had, if not forgiveness, at least company. But one morning, when the mist was still spilling over the garden like warm milk on an antique table, Clarisse received a thin envelope, with no return address, marked with faded ink. It was addressed to her full name, Clarisse Vernier-Durand. He recognized it immediately. It was Lucien's handwriting. It had been dated 3 days before his death. She opened it with firm hands, sitting in the music room with the window ajar and the portrait watching without intervention. "Clarisse, I don't know if you're on my side or theirs. Sometimes I'm not even sure which side is which. I've searched for the truth behind the portrait, but maybe I'm searching for a voice that never existed. Or maybe you have one and just haven't used it yet. There's a phrase I wrote over and over. Again, the painting doesn't see me. I thought it was a metaphor, but now I believe it was literal. I've dreamed many times that the face fades away while I look at it, that the face sinks into the canvas, that it leaves me alone. Asterisk, I know you think I'm crazy, but if you're reading this, maybe you'd like to know something I haven't told anyone. The original painting, the first one, I saw it once without anyone knowing. When I was 15, it was in the attic, wrapped in a rough cloth, and it wasn't the same face. It didn't just look different. He wasn't the same man. I mean it, Clarisse. It wasn't just a Retouch. It was another face. Similar, yes, but younger, more severe, as if it had been completely replaced. And that, ... doesn't make sense. Maybe you can understand it. Or find it. Maybe I didn't know how to look. But you've always seen what others don't dare to look at. Lucian and Clara slowed the letter slowly. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the possibility that Lucian was telling the truth, or the fact that, deep down, a part of her had already suspected it. That afternoon, without telling anyone, she went up to the attic alone. The door was sealed with dust and oblivion, but the key still hung on the hook in the pantry, as if waiting. The attic smelled of aged wood, dried ink, and frozen time. He began searching. Labeled boxes, unopened trunks, frames without canvases, until, in a corner behind a broken shelf, he found what he hadn't expected: a carefully rolled second canvas, protected by a thick linen wrapper. It wasn't a copy, the portrait. He slowly unrolled it. The air seemed to stop. It wasn't the same face that hung in the music room, and it was not the same face that Poirot had revealed as the original. This portrait showed a younger man. The same facial structure, yes, but the expression was different, intense, almost defiant. The eyes were clear, deeply intelligent, but hard. The background was not the same living room. It was a bare wall, without decoration, and in the lower corner, for the first time, there was a signature. Clarisse read it several times before believing it. Sevy Charles Vernier, his father. That night, when everyone was asleep, Clarisse joined Marianne in the green parlour. She showed her the portrait. She didn't say anything at first. She just left it unfolded on the piano. Marianne looked at him for a long time. "He's not the same," he said finally. "This man... he's not afraid." Clarisse nodded. "Maybe that's why he was replaced. And what are we going to do with him? Hang it, not in the music room, but in the house... where?" Clarisse looked toward the hallway leading to the servants' quarters. There, between walls without pictures and lamps without history, there was space, a place without lineage, a place without meaning... Yet, in the last hallway, the one no one crosses. Let anyone who dares look. The next day, with Marianne's silent help, Clarisse hung the real portrait of Charles Vernier. No one made an announcement. Nobody asked, but little by little, some saw it. Madame Fournier, who said nothing but left fresh flowers under the frame. Beaumont, who walked past him and did not look up. Even Madame Vernier, who crossed the hall one afternoon and stood before him for a long time. She didn't cry. She only touched the frame with a very light hand. "You finally looked like yourself," he murmured. Finally, that night, Clarisse wrote a letter. It was not addressed to Poirot, nor to the lawyer, nor even to Lucian, only herself. They hid it because they didn't know what to do with such a vivid truth. They replaced it with a more manageable silence. But the portraits don't disappear. They just wait for someone to look at them again with fearless eyes. Chapter 14. The wall where no one signed. Villavernier had many walls. Some displayed portraits of ancestors with chests puffed out with pride. Others were covered with flowered tapestries, and yet another showed cracks that the plaster hadn't managed to hide. But there was one wall that had never had anything hanging on it. Not a mirror, not a clock, not even a lingering shadow. It was at the end of the north wing, next to the room the gardener had once used when the estate still had lived lemon trees, and it was, by far, the whitest of all. It was there, that Poirot decided to stop the following morning. He was alone, strolling with his small, firm steps, when he noticed what no one had mentioned: an entire wall in a house filled with hanging genealogies without a single visual signature. And what's more, the paint there seemed more recent. Not new, not shiny, but thicker, as if someone had covered something over. Poirot narrowed his eyes. The silence in the corridor was pure, like that of a confessional before the first sin. "Very interesting," he murmured, stroking his moustache. The detective took a small, round mirror out of his pocket. He didn't use it out of vanity, as many thought, but out of habit. A reflection could reveal more than a surface. He turned it at different angles, observing the light bouncing off the painting. And there it was, a faint, barely perceptible line in the shape of a rectangular frame, covered, hidden. Poirot needed nothing more. "Did you know," he later asked Madame Vernier, with a gentleness laden with gravity, "that in the north wing there is a wall that once held a painting?" The old woman tensed, not so much because of the question, but because of what it implied. "Oh, many walls are there in this house, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, smiling as if speaking to a child. "Some lose pictures, others gain them. Life rearranges itself. And yet, the paint used to cover that area doesn't quite match the age of the rest, and that tells you anything." "Yes, it tells me there was something there that should have been forgotten, but forgotten completely. No signature, no gap, no rumor." Madame Vernier leaned slowly on her cane. Her eyes, for a second, lost their matriarchal rigidity. "My father had that painting covered up when I was barely a teenager. He said there was something about the expression on my face that made him unbearable. He didn't tell me any more, and I didn't ask again." Poirot bowed his head, thanking her for the sincerity. "But it wasn't enough. Do you remember whose portrait it was?" "From his younger brother. His name was Etienne Vernier, but everyone called him the Silent One, because he didn't speak to anyone. I never heard him utter a single word. He died young. No one liked his portrait. Did he die young, at 26, under circumstances that were never fully explained? They said it was a fall, but no one knew why he was alone in the gardens." At that hour, Poirot felt a vibration inside him, not of emotion, but of recognition. A line buried in the past that still dripped into the present. "And then, Madame, your portrait was covered, your name forgotten, and the wall fell silent." A curious tribute. The Verniers have always had their ways of processing grief, or to hide the guilt. That afternoon, Poirot asked for a spatula. Not from an assistant, not from an inspector. He asked for it himself, in the exact tone that Brooks, no reply. No one dared contradict him. With slow, delicate movements, he began to scrape the wall. The paint yielded with silent resistance, as if the house itself refused to yield its last secret. After almost an hour of careful work, a silhouette appeared. It was a frame, yes, but what it contained wasn't a typical portrait. It was an interior wall of pure plaster, covered by a repeated signature, written in charcoal in a nervous, angular handwriting. "He wasn't me." Again and again. "He wasn't me. He wasn't me." Poirot took a step back, not out of fear, but out of respect. Something had overflowed there. Not art, not history, something more intimate, more decomposed. When Poirot gathered Marianne and Clarisse to show them what he had discovered, both remained completely silent. Clarisse was the first to speak. "Is it possible that Etienne and Charles were confused?" or that one assumed the other's identity, said Poirot, or that someone simply wanted to erase one of them entirely. But why? That, mademoiselle, is the question that has yet to be answered. But this inscription, this repetition, is an act of desperation, not of madness, not of art, of someone trying to resist being turned into another dot. Marianne, her face pale, whispered, "What if it wasn't a murder for money, ... but for a name?" Poirot nodded slowly. The tone of the game had changed. It was no longer just about the portrait. It was about identity from the accepted version of a family story, and the one that was covered over with a broad brush. "The truth is near," Poirot said quietly, "as near as a faded signature." And he looked at that wall once more, not because of what it showed, but because of what he had tried to hide for so long. Chapter 15. The man who signed with another name. Night had fallen over the Villa Vernier, like a sheet too heavy. Heavy not with rest, but with ancient murmurs. The discovery of the inscribed wall, that litany of "he wasn't me," had sown a disquiet that not even silence could contain. The oil lamps, with their pale flickering, barely managed to attenuate the density of the atmosphere, as if every shadow in the house contained a lost identity. Poirot, however, seemed in his element. He walked with a short but purposeful stride, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes scanning the corners as if searching for the trace of a thought yet to form. That same evening, he asked Marianne to show him Charles Vernier's locked office. According to family records, Charles, the elder brother of the silent Etienne, had been a reserved man, fond of pocket watches and the study of family heraldry. He had died 2 decades earlier, of natural causes, it was said, but Poirot suspected that in this story the men were borrowed suits, and some were too big for the person wearing them. The office was in the east wing, sandwiched between 2 rarely used rooms. The dark wooden door had an antique lock that still had its original key. Marianne turned it with a certain solemnity, as if opening the room would release something more than dust. The air inside was dry, but not dirty. Everything seemed orderly to the extreme. Books aligned to the millimeter, pens neatly arranged, yellowed sheets of paper still in folders, and, above all, a glass display case housing a set of pens signed with gilt initials, E.V. Curious. Poirot murmured, "These pens don't bear Charles's initials, but Etienne's." "Maybe they were a gift," Marianne suggested, though her voice was now sounding more uncertain than questioning. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps, or perhaps the office was never Charles's, mademoiselle. Perhaps this was the last refuge of Etienne, or of whoever claimed to be Charles." He approached the desk. He inspected it meticulously, caressing the surface like someone listening with their fingertips. Then he slowly opened the drawers. In the third, next to some unused envelopes, he found a hardcover notebook. He opened it delicately. It was a diary, but it didn't have a name. The first pages were bland, references to the weather, family finances, gardening tasks. But then the more in-depth, more personal entries began. "Today, Marianne asked me about the portrait. I told her it was taken down because of humidity, but honestly, I couldn't stand it anymore. Her gaze seemed to accuse me." Poirot read silently, his eyes narrowing. "Sometimes I wake up and don't know who I am. My father's voice confuses me. He says Charles, but I remember him as Etienne. Is there no difference anymore? My God," he exclaimed in a whisper. He closed the diary, turning slowly towards Marianne. Have you ever noticed anything strange about your Uncle Charles? Erratic behavior, prolonged absences, contradictions. She hesitated. As a child, he seemed like a distant man to me. Sometimes he said things that didn't make sense, as if he were talking to someone invisible. But no one paid attention to it. They said it was him mourning the death of his brother, or his own death. Poirot wasn't aiming for drama with that sentence. He said it as if he'd simply solved a mathematical problem. What disturbed him wasn't the conclusion, but its devastating logic. Late that night, Poirot retired to his room. There, on the bedside table, he placed the diary along with 3 objects: an undated family photograph, a letter written by Clarice, and a gold button he had found in the library. He connected them with his gaze, not with words. The diary suggested an impersonation, a stolen identity, a death silenced so another life could continue. But what Poirot still didn't understand was why someone had relived that trauma now, so many years later. What motivated Clarice to paint that cursed portrait? And why did that portrait, as he himself had noticed, never face exactly the same direction? Someone had reactivated a dormant truth. Someone who knew that the past still breathed. The next morning, Poirot asked to see Clarice alone. They gathered in the glass-enclosed gallery, where the light fell softly and the plants gave off a serene scent. Clarice looked at him curiously, but not without fear. Mademoiselle Poirot began in a measured voice, "Your portrait, the one you painted recently, what inspired it?" A photograph, a remembered face. Clarice bit her lip. "I wasn't inspired by anything. It was an impulse. I dreamed about that man for weeks. I saw him standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection didn't follow him. And in the dream, I always said, 'It's not me, it's not me.' When I woke up, the image was clear. So I painted him." Poirot inclined his head, and he'd never told anyone about this. "No, I thought it was a passing obsession. But now it scares me." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "You're not the only one being harassed by that phrase." He stood up. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You've done more than you know." As he walked away, Poirot realized that everything revolved around this fragmentation. A man who had become another, a portrait that could not hold a single gaze, and a family that had decided not to remember what should not be known. It was no longer a question of finding out who had committed the most recent crime. It was a matter of understanding who the real victim was. From the beginning, Chapter 16. The signature that didn't match. Dawn spread its veil of light over the Villa Vernier. But inside the house, the rooms remained shrouded in a gloom of secrets that the light could not dispel. The sheets in the empty rooms remained smooth, unchanged, as if the memories had quietly retreated. However, in Poirot's makeshift study, the little grey cells were already in full operation. Sitting by an open window, Poirot pored over Clarice's letter, that unfinished missive found in his room, its last lines trembling with uncertain writing. Beside him, the anonymous diary found in the study lay like a silent heart that, though no longer beating, could still betray a secret life. It was on one word that Poirot fixed his attention: "Forgive me." Not "forgive me," as a guilty person might have said, confessing his crime. "Don't forgive us," as someone might say, speaking for someone else. But "forgive me," like someone who knows he is a traitor to everyone. Later that morning, Poirot requested access to the family notarial archives. At the villa, the butler delivered a carefully sealed wooden box containing deeds, wills, and property documents. Among them, Poirot was looking for one thing: signatures, sometimes Hastings. He had told her years ago with a sardonic smile, "A man's soul is more visible in the stroke of his signature than in his eyes." He didn't need to compare entire manuscripts or analyze psychological traits. He simply wanted to see a signature attributed to Charles Vernier before 1907 and another afterward. If his hypothesis was correct, that brief ink curve would contain a fatal contradiction. And there it was, a bill of sale dated 1906, signed by Charles E. Vernier with a firm, broad signature slanted to the left. Then a private letter sent in 1912, also attributed to Charles, but with a different signature, smaller, upright, and hesitant at the end. Not only that, the handwriting style in the body of the letter clearly matched the journal entries found. Poirot smiled slightly, but without mirth. "My dear, he betrayed himself through his lack of trust. The man who signed this letter wasn't the same, or not entirely. The transformation had been slow, carefully calculated. It wasn't a vulgar forgery, but a gradual adoption of identity. Someone, probably Etienne, had taken his brother Charles's place after his death, appropriating not only his social position, but also his silence." But why? In the dining room, Poirot met Dr. Mercier, a guest from the nearby village and former physician to the Vernier family. He had come to the house on a trivial matter, but Poirot took the opportunity to ask him a polite question. "Doctor, do you remember caring for Monsieur Charles Vernier in his later years?" The old man frowned. "Oh, of course. Or at least I thought so for a long time. Although now that you mention it, it always seemed strange to me that your condition kept changing. First it was a chronic digestive problem, then rheumatism, then insomnia. As if the identity of the body changed, but the medical history couldn't keep up." Poirot nodded silently. Medicine, he thought, sometimes encounters ghosts beyond its science. And did you ever notice anything disturbing? "There was one night," the doctor said after some thought. "It was 1913. I remember being called in urgently. Mr. Vernier had suffered what was described as a panic attack. I found him screaming in front of the mirror. He was saying, 'It's not me, it's not me, thank you, doctor.'" It was enlightening. That evening, Poirot allowed himself a stroll through the garden. Clarisse followed him a few steps in silence, as if she too was searching for answers in the shadows of the hedges. "Do you think it's crazy, Monsieur Poirot, to think that a portrait can change by itself?" "A portrait, mademoiselle? No, but I will tell you this: faces change, and sometimes the crime isn't taking someone's life, but taking their reflection." She looked at him, troubled. "Do you believe that the man they called Charles was actually Etienne?" Poirot stopped at a stone bench under a 100-year-old elm tree. "I still don't believe it. I see it. I hear it in every silence in this house. I feel it in the way certain names were avoided, in how everyone accepted a substitution because it was more comfortable than the truth." Clarisse sat down, hugging her arms. "And why would anyone do that? What do you gain by stealing a name?" Poirot smiled softly. "Sometimes you gain nothing, mademoiselle. Sometimes you just run away from something, from guilt, from forbidden love, from betrayal. And in that flight, you borrow another's skin, but the soul, ... Ah, that one never fully obeys." Upon returning to his room, Poirot jotted down a simple sentence in his notebook: "The portrait changes because the truth is disturbed." Below is a diagram. Diary, Same handwriting as letter from 1912. Different signature. Before and after 1907. Scream in front of the mirror. Medical testimony. Clarice. Dreams of a face without reflection. Phrase repeated on the wall, in dreams, in letters. It's not me. Poirot closed the notebook. The puzzle was taking shape, not through obvious clues, but through a persistent echo of distorted identities. Someone at the Villa Vernia had lived with a secret for too long, and now the secret was beginning to live on its own. Chapter 17. The second portrait. Morning descended upon Villa Vernia with a deceptive clarity. The sun, still timid, caressed the leaves of the garden with golden fingers, but the air seemed to hold a discordant note, as if even the breeze had sensed that something in the house was out of order. Poirot, unusually silent at breakfast, gazed into his cup of coffee with such concentration that Hastings, who was accompanying him that morning, visiting from London, refrained from even commenting on the temperature of the eggs. Hastings, Poirot finally murmured, without taking his eyes off his cup, "Do you remember the portrait in the drawing-room, Mr. Vernier's?" "Yes, of course. It's curious. I can't explain it, but every time I look at him, I swear his expression changes." "No, no, my friend, it doesn't change, but we do. What we know, what we feel, changes. And what the portrait reflects is, in reality, an omission. Something missing, something that watches us from absence." Hastings frowned. "Do you mean there is another portrait?" "Precisely, one that has been hidden. And I suspect that in that forgotten painting lies the first attempt at silence. With the help of Judith, the youngest niece in the family, Poirot asked to explore the villa's attic. It was a dusty, quiet place, with closed chests and trunks covered in sheets that creaked like old skin when touched. The ceiling beams wailed with every step, and the air smelled of sealed furniture and letters never read again. "This is where the objects from the old wing were kept when the house was renovated," Judith explained, holding up the lantern. "My uncle didn't want to keep anything from his childhood. No portraits or furniture. They seemed insincere, he once said." Poirot stopped before a large canvas covered with a green cloth. He touched it delicately, as if anticipating an encounter with a ghost. When he removed the cloth, a layer of dust rose into the air, revealing a dark-toned portrait. It was another Charles Vernier, but not the Charles known to the family in his late 20s. This man younger, with a gaunt face, vivid blue eyes, and an introspective expression, seemed to be observing not the viewer, but something behind him, a gaze buried in silent doubt. In the frame, barely visible, is an engraving. "Charles Etienne Vernier, 1905. "That's not the same man from the parlour," Judith murmured, surprised. "But ... who is it then?" "Exactly, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently. "It's not the same man, and yet it's the same name." Back in the office, Poirot asked to see the family albums. With them fanned out on the table, he examined the photographs with surgical precision. The images of Charles between 1895 and 1906 showed a man with a stern, distant expression. Then, from 1908 onward, the photos revealed a different subject, more robust, with a more open smile, a different moustache. The change was as subtle as it was definitive. Hastings, with a magnifying glass in hand, compared the images. Could it be that Charles just grew old? Poirot shook his head. Aging, yes, but not changing bone structure. Look at the ears, Hastings. In a man, the ears are the key. These aren't the same ones. My God, so you mean that ... that someone took Charles's place after 1907, and not just anyone, someone who shared the same surname, who knew the family history, someone who had an urgent reason to disappear ... and another to be found, but as a different man. Poirot descended into the garden again at dusk. Clarisse was waiting for him by the pond, a closed book in her lap. Her eyes, tired but determined, looked at him with a mixture of fear and understanding. "I found something else," she said bluntly, "in the back of my mother's closet, hidden behind a loose board. It was a letter, unsigned, but ... it speaks of a promise. One they would have to keep if the truth ever came back to haunt them." Poirot took the sheet of paper carefully. The paper was old, the words crooked, as if they had been written with tremors. The message was brief. We couldn't play the game anymore. He knew it, but as long as no one looks at the other portrait, the game continues. "Clarisse," said Poirot in a low voice, "do you know who the mirror in the hall originally belonged to?" She thought for a few seconds. "My grandmother, but when she died, it was taken away for years. They returned it recently, at Marianne's insistence." "Marianne," Poirot repeated, looking at the horizon. "Yes, the girl who grew up among reflections, but not with the truth." Upon re-entering the villa, Poirot asked for the gardener, old Bousquet, who had served the family since before the Great War. The man, stooped and deep-voiced, greeted him with a mixture of respect and suspicion. "Do you remember, Monsieur Bousquet, the day Monsieur Charles left in 1907? I didn't see him leave. No one saw him. They just said he'd gone to Paris. But then he appeared again the following year, quieter, thinner. He no longer walked the dog. He no longer looked out the windows, and you never doubted that. It was him." "Monsieur Poirot," the old man said, lowering his voice, "we servants see things, but we also learn to keep quiet about them. Only mirrors repeat what one keeps quiet about. And here, for years, the mirrors were removed." Poirot dismissed him with a grave bow. He now had everything he needed, or almost everything. That evening, alone in his study, Poirot opened his notebook again. Beside the original portrait, he drew the outline of a second, barely sketched figure. Beneath it, he wrote, "Two men. One. Signature, a house where the past isn't buried, but disguised." Poirot closed his notebook, stood up, and straightened his tie. It was time to gather everyone together. The next day, he would invite them to the living room, and there, in front of the portrait, the game would end. Chapter 18. The look of the portrait. The living room of the Villa Vernier was absolutely silent. The curtains were drawn, the clocks stopped, and the portrait of Charles Vernier, the one who never looked the same, would presided over the room with an even stranger aura. The guests were all present, summoned without explanation by Hercule Poirot that morning: Clarisse, Judith, Marianne, Dr. Louvert, the notary, Morel, the gardener, Bousquet, and the housekeeper, Madame Renaud, all the hidden threads of the house. Finally reunited, Poirot stood, composed, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice, when he spoke, was as soft as cutting velvet. "My lords and ladies, I have requested this meeting not out of courtesy, but because the moment of truth has arrived. A murder has taken place, yes, but also an older, more subtle crime, one of identity, of silence, and of substitution." He turned to the portrait. "The man we see in this painting is not Charles Etienne Vernier. He isn't," he repeated. As some faces paled, because the real Charles disappeared in 1907, and the man who returned, quieter, more robust, kinder to some and crueler to others, was his cousin, Auguste Vernier, a ruined man, dogged by debt and with nothing left to lose. Judith covered her mouth. Clarisse, without moving, gripped the arm of the chair. Poirot approached the portrait. The real Charles died in Paris. But Auguste, who had always envied his position, took his place, and the family silently accepted, out of fear for money or for convenience. Only one person knew the truth from the beginning: Madame Vernier, Clarisse's mother. She hid the original portrait in the attic, replaced the albums, closed the mirrors. But even the oldest mirrors have memories. The detective turned to Marianne. Mademoiselle, you said you always felt something wasn't right in this house, because you are the daughter of that first Charles, an illegitimate child, born of an unacknowledged affair, but left by his mother in Clarisse's silent care. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Auguste accepted you as a domestic nuisance, but never with true affection. Marianne said nothing. She just lowered her gaze. There was an ancient echo in her silence, as if she already knew. And then we come to the murder, Poirot continued gravely. Auguste, already elderly, had begun to talk in his sleep. Sometimes he mentioned Charles, the replacement, the true inheritance. Clarisse heard him, and Judith too. It was only a matter of time before someone put the pieces together, or confessed. Notary Morel spoke for the first time, nervously. That would explain the new clause in the will, the one that directly benefited Marianne. Precisely, said Poirot. Auguste feared that everything would come to light and wanted to redeem himself posthumously. But Clarisse wouldn't allow it. Not out of malice, but out of pride. All her life she had kept the scaffolding of silence upright. She wouldn't allow it to collapse in the twilight. So, one night, she poisoned his liquor, with poison obtained from the greenhouse, carefully diluted in a floral cyanide concoction. A murmur ran through the room. Clarisse stood up slowly. Her face held no guilt, but rather an elegant resignation. Not out of hatred, he said, but out of order. This house had lived off that lie. He had no right to die telling the truth. Poirot lowered his head, not in condemnation, but in recognition of a terrible, almost Aristotelian logic. And yet, Madame, the truth survives even generations, because the portrait in the drawing room is a mirror of our omissions. You thought that by placing the new painting, by hiding the old, the past was erased. But the eye that never looked the same way was actually the eye of the beholder. We change, and finally we see what we should have seen all along. The police arrived. Minutes later, Clarisse didn't resist. Marianne didn't cry. She simply took the old portrait of Charles, the real one, and placed it over the fireplace, where the figure looked out with melancholic tenderness, as if knowing he had finally been remembered. Said goodbye on the steps, his hat in his hand and his shoes impeccably polished. Hastings, who had watched everything without interruption, approached him. Do you think that's fair, Poirot? No, not justice. Just ... balance. A lie that was sustained for decades. Today, at least, the frame has been corrected. The canvas was painted long ago, and with a melancholy smile. The detective went down the steps, crossed the garden that now shone with a new dawn, and disappeared down the path, as if the case had been nothing more than a badly hung portrait.